The atmosphere on April 9, 1865, was thick with the gravity of a nation's turning point as two men prepared for an encounter in a secluded Virginian settlement. On one side stood Robert E. Lee, the composed and stately commanding officer of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, a figure whose very presence commanded respect even in what would become his ultimate defeat. He approaches the Appomattox courthouse, his attire pristine, his dress sword shining brightly on his hip, an emblem of his honor, even amidst a loss that would forever change the course of American history. His counterpart is Ulysses S. Grant, leader of the Union armies, who appears hours afterward wearing a coat spattered with mud, more befitting an infantryman than a commanding general, yet whose strategic brilliance had brought the Confederacy to its knees. Within the unassuming brick residence of Wilmer McLean, these two figures sit opposite one another, the weight of 4 years of brutal conflict resting on their shoulders as they prepared to negotiate the terms that would ultimately reshape a fractured nation. They converse, execute paperwork, and clasp hands in a moment that would be forever immortalized in the annals of American history. Beyond the walls, troops await with bated breath, some in hushed stillness, others weeping openly as the reality of their defeat begins to settle in. It has concluded, or so it would appear to those who witnessed this pivotal moment, but the full story extends far beyond what happened in that modest parlor on that fateful spring day. For decades, this event has been enshrined as the conclusion of America's most brutal war, the Civil War, a conflict that claimed more American lives than any other in history and fundamentally transformed the nation's identity. Yet, what if this was not the genuine finale? What if this encounter at Appomattox represented merely a single chapter in a much longer and more complex story of surrender and reconciliation? What compelling factors ultimately drove Lee to capitulate after so vehemently swearing he never would? Could this meeting have been deliberately arranged for its powerful symbolic value, designed to send a message of unity to a divided nation? Did a key general's counsel significantly influence Lee toward surrender against his initial instincts? And what explains the persistent combat that continued for an additional 16 months following this historic day, long after the famous handshake between Grant and Lee? Today, we are revealing the details history frequently omits concerning that pivotal instant at Appomattox, the hidden realities behind Lee's capitulation, and its long-term consequences that continue to echo through American society. But before we start unraveling these complex historical threads, make sure to like and subscribe to Rootvolutionary to become part of our growing community of history enthusiasts seeking deeper understanding beyond the textbook narratives. General Robert E. Lee is famously quoted as saying he would prefer to perish 1,000 times than yield to Ulysses S. Grant, a statement that perfectly captured his unwavering commitment to the Confederate cause. For years, he had personified the Confederate defiance, a master strategist who had guided his forces through the war's most renowned engagements, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chancellorsville, often against numerically superior Union forces. His determination appeared absolute, his resolve unshakable, even in the face of mounting casualties and strategic setbacks. But by the start of April 1865, the situation had shifted profoundly and irreversibly against the Confederate commander. After close to 10 months of vicious trench combat surrounding Petersburg and Richmond, a brutal war of attrition that tested both armies to their absolute limits, Union armies commanded by Grant finally ruptured Confederate defenses on April 2nd at Five Forks, a decisive engagement that would ultimately seal the fate of the Confederate capital. This critical development compelled Lee to evacuate both cities, the very core of the Confederacy, and move west with his famished and depleted military in a desperate attempt to regroup and continue the fight. The withdrawal was nothing less than a calamity, a harrowing retreat through the Virginia countryside with Union forces in close pursuit, striking at the vulnerable Confederate columns at every opportunity. By April 5th, Lee had arrived at Amelia Courthouse, anticipating locating urgently required provisions that had been promised to sustain his exhausted army for the continued campaign. But none were there, a devastating logistical failure that further crippled his army's already diminished fighting capability. His soldiers were ravenous, disheartened, and under relentless attack from Union cavalry led by the aggressive General Philip Sheridan, whose forces harried the Confederate retreat at every turn, capturing supplies and prisoners in increasing numbers. On April 6th at Sailor's Creek, almost one-fourth of Lee's force was taken prisoner or slain in one catastrophic clash that represented one of the most devastating defeats of the entire war for the Confederacy. Observing this collapse from a nearby ridge, Lee is said to have cried out in despair, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" as he witnessed the disintegration of his once proud fighting force. By April 8th, the hopelessness was evident to even the most optimistic Confederate officers, with Union troops having barricaded Lee's advance at Appomattox Station and seized crucial supplies intended for his men, effectively sealing off any possible escape route. Encircled completely and devoid of any backup or paths for retreat, his men reduced to eating parched corn and whatever scraps they could forage from the countryside, Lee reached the monumental conclusion to meet with Grant and negotiate conditions for surrender, recognizing that continued resistance would only result in further meaningless bloodshed. In spite of his prior oath never to capitulate, a promise made at the height of Confederate power and optimism, Lee selected practical necessity over vanity, putting the welfare of his remaining soldiers above his personal pride and sense of honor. He understood that prolonging the conflict would only lead to more futile mortality and anguish, not solely for his troops, but for non-combatants throughout the South who had already suffered 4 years of ruin, their homes destroyed, farms ravaged, and communities torn apart by the relentless machinery of war. While Lee grappled with the verdict to surrender, one of his most relied-upon generals was instrumental in guiding his decision. James Longstreet, a trusted subordinate whose counsel had often proven valuable throughout the conflict. Longstreet had stood with Lee for the majority of the conflict, a realistic commander recognized for evaluating circumstances with detached rationality instead of passion, a quality that made his advice particularly valuable in this moment of crisis. By the beginning of April 1865, Longstreet saw that any additional opposition was pointless, recognizing that the mathematical realities of the situation made further resistance not just difficult, but fundamentally impossible against the overwhelming Union advantage in men and material. The Army of Northern Virginia was overwhelmed in number, outflanked, and depleting its resources at an alarming rate, with many soldiers lacking even basic ammunition for their weapons after the supply trains had been captured. On April 9th at Appomattox Station, General John B. Gordon communicated that his corps had been fought to exhaustion during an assault on Union cavalry obstructing their western route, reporting that his men had literally given their last full measure of devotion to the cause. Devoid of any prospect of piercing Union lines or obtaining support from other Confederate forces that were themselves facing destruction, Longstreet is said to have counseled Lee that submission was their sole remaining practical alternative, arguing that an honorable surrender now would preserve what little remained of the Army's dignity and prevent further unnecessary casualties. Nonetheless, not every officer concurred with Longstreet's realism, with some preferring to fight to the bitter end, rather than accept defeat at the hands of their northern opponents. Brigadier General Edward Porter Alexander proposed disbanding the Army into minor units and initiating a guerrilla campaign against Union troops, a tactic he thought could extend resistance for an indefinite period, transforming the conflict from a conventional war between armies into a protracted struggle of ambushes and irregular warfare that might eventually weary the Northern will to continue the fight. But both Longstreet and Lee dismissed this notion completely, recognizing that such a strategy would only prolong the suffering without altering the ultimate outcome, while potentially destroying what remained of civilized society in the South. Longstreet's impact in these ultimate hours echoed his wider philosophy during the war, which had always emphasized practical military considerations over political ideology or romantic notions of honor. Pragmatic choices intended to reduce needless agony, even if it involved acknowledging a loss that would be personally devastating to the proud Confederate commander who had fought so long and so well against overwhelming odds. A compelling query historians have pondered is if Lee's surrender at Appomattox was staged, not as in fabricated, but as a meticulously planned event intended for its allegorical significance and potential for reunification, designed to provide a symbolic conclusion to the bloodiest chapter in American history. Ponder this compelling historical question as we examine the evidence. Grant proposed exceptionally generous conditions to Lee and his soldiers, terms that surprised many in the North who had expected harsh punishment for the rebellion. Confederate troops were permitted to go back to their homes after relinquishing their weapons, rather than being marched off to prison camps, provided they pledged not to take up arms against the United States again. Officers could retain their personal firearms and private mounts, a significant concession that allowed them to preserve some measure of their dignity and provided necessary transportation and protection for their journey home. And no individual would be tried for treason provided they honored their paroles and obeyed the laws of the United States, a remarkable act of clemency that helped smooth the path toward reconciliation between former enemies. Grant even supplied food for Lee's starving men, a total of 25,000 rations that literally meant the difference between survival and starvation for many Confederate soldiers who had not eaten properly in days, a humanitarian gesture that immediately began to heal the wounds of war. These conditions were not merely functional, they were profoundly emblematic of the approach that Grant and Lincoln wished to take toward the defeated South. By permitting Confederate soldiers to go home with their pride intact and even retain their horses for agriculture, Grant established a mood of forgiveness instead of retribution, recognizing that the goal was to reunite the nation rather than punish the defeated rebels. This method was not Grant's alone. It embodied President Abraham Lincoln's wish for a tranquil merging of North and South, a vision of reconciliation that the president had articulated just weeks earlier in his second inaugural address, when he urged the nation to bind up its wounds with malice toward none, with charity for all. Even Wilmer McLean's home, the location of the surrender, contributed a layer of symbolism that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental. McLean had relocated there after his previous property near Bull Run had been damaged during one of the war's initial battles in 1861, literally moving to escape the conflict that had begun practically in his front yard. Now, 4 years later, destiny had placed him back into history as the conflict ceased beneath his roof, creating a poetic bookending to the war that had begun and ended on his properties. A remarkable coincidence that many interpreted as a sign of divine providence overseeing the nation's reconciliation. Was this entirely chance, or was it meticulously arranged by leaders who understood the power of symbolism in helping to heal a divided nation? While we might never be certain of the exact degree of planning involved, it is obvious that Appomattox evolved into far more than a mere military defeat, transforming into a powerful symbol of national reconciliation that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. While Appomattox denoted a crucial juncture in American history, it did not indicate the demise of the Confederacy, as many assume, with significant Confederate forces remaining in the field across various parts of the South, still willing and able to continue the struggle despite Lee's capitulation. General Robert E. Lee surrendered solely his Army of Northern Virginia, not every Confederate military unit across the South, a critical distinction that explains why the war continued for months after the famous meeting in the McLean parlor. At that exact time, other Confederate armies remained operational over enormous regions, from the Carolinas to the Deep South and across the Mississippi River, still flying the Confederate flag and resisting Union authority. General Joseph E. Johnston led thousands of soldiers in North Carolina until his surrender on April 26th, following extended discussions with General Sherman, 17 days after Appomattox, in the largest single surrender of the war, which finally eliminated organized Confederate resistance in the Eastern Theater. Lieutenant General Richard Taylor kept resisting Union forces in Alabama and Mississippi until May 4th, when he finally yielded after hearing of Johnston's capitulation, recognizing that continued resistance without support from other Confederate armies was strategically hopeless. West of the Mississippi River, Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith persisted even longer, declining to surrender until May 26th in Galveston, Texas. His command representing the last significant Confederate force in the field, isolated from the events in the East, but still theoretically capable of continuing the struggle. In Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, Brigadier General Stand Watie, a Cherokee chief leading Native American soldiers who had cast their lot with the Confederacy, refused to disarm until June 23rd, rendering him the final Confederate general to surrender, a full 2.5 months after Appomattox. Even Confederate President Jefferson Davis would not admit defeat after escaping Richmond on April 2nd, continuing to proclaim the Confederacy's legitimacy and urging continued resistance despite the increasingly desperate military situation. Apprehended on May 10th near Irwinville, Georgia, Davis was convinced guerrilla tactics could rekindle Southern aspirations for sovereignty, a conviction held by certain Confederate leaders who continued hostilities well into mid-1865, hoping to prolong the conflict until political changes in the North might bring about a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. Although April 9, 1865 is frequently recalled as the symbolic cessation of the Civil War, the truth was significantly more complex, with fighting continuing in various forms and locations for many months after Lee's surrender. General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse signaled the demise of his Army of Northern Virginia, but it did not imply the whole Confederacy had yielded, as significant regions remained under Confederate control, and thousands of soldiers remained under arms across the South. Actually, warfare persisted in different areas of the South for weeks and months after Appomattox. From small skirmishes between isolated Confederate units and Union patrols to larger engagements like the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas, fought on May 12 to 13, 1865, which ironically became the last land battle of the war and resulted in a Confederate victory weeks after the major surrenders. And it was not until August 20, 1866, 16 months afterward, that President Andrew Johnson officially proclaimed the Civil War ended, a remarkably long time after the last significant military engagement, reflecting the complicated process of establishing federal authority throughout the South and securing the surrender of all Confederate forces, both regular and irregular. The causes for this extended duration arose from multiple interrelated factors that complicated the conclusion of hostilities. Delayed information transmission meant that news of Lee's surrender spread slowly across the vast geographical expanse of the South, particularly to remote areas where communication infrastructure had been destroyed by the war. Disjointed Confederate opposition continued in various forms, from organized military units that had not yet received surrender orders to irregular guerrilla bands that rejected the peace process entirely. Enduring skirmishes between Union occupation forces and Confederate holdouts kept the embers of conflict smoldering long after the major surrenders. And political holdups at the highest levels of government illustrated how divided the country stayed, even after Lee put down his weapons, with debates raging about the terms of Reconstruction and the status of the defeated Confederate states. In 1865, communication throughout the United States was sluggish and undependable by contemporary measures, with the telegraph network limited and much information still traveling by horseback or ship. Reports of Lee's surrender on April 9th required days and, in certain instances, weeks to get to other Confederate commanders dispersed across huge distances, particularly those operating west of the Mississippi River, who were effectively isolated from events in the Eastern Theater, without verification that Lee had surrendered or that Richmond had been taken, and with many suspecting that reports of Confederate defeat were Union propaganda. Numerous Confederate generals kept fighting under the impression that their mission remained viable, that the cause was not yet lost, and that their continued resistance might yet turn the tide, or at least secure better terms for surrender. The surrender at Appomattox is often recalled as the instant the cannon fire ceased and the country started to mend, a neat endpoint to 4 years of bloody conflict. But as we have revealed, this was only a portion of the narrative, a simplified version that obscures the complex and protracted process that actually unfolded across the South in the months following that famous meeting. Lee's surrender did not terminate the Confederacy, nor did it deliver instant tranquility to a war-ravaged nation struggling to find its way forward. It was a symbolic deed, a move of respect and rapprochement between military professionals who had fought each other with determination, but now recognized the need to begin healing the nation's wounds. But the war's reverberations would remain for months, even years, as the shattered nation labored to reconstruct itself physically, politically, and socially through the difficult process of reconstruction. What if Lee had opted for guerrilla warfare over surrender, following General Alexander's advice to dissolve the army into the countryside and continue a partisan struggle against Union occupation? What if Jefferson Davis had succeeded in escaping and reassembling Confederate militaries in the trans-Mississippi West, establishing a government in exile that could have prolonged the conflict indefinitely? Might the war have continued further, draining Union resources and political will? Or would it have concluded in even more immense destruction and bitterness that might have made reconciliation impossible? These are queries that still linger over this historical segment, inviting us to consider how different choices might have altered America's path in the critical period after Appomattox. So now we pose it to you, our audience, to reflect on these complex historical questions. Was Lee's choice to surrender a deed of integrity that saved countless lives and allowed the nation to begin healing, or was it simply an unavoidable outcome given his hopeless military situation? Was Grant's generosity a brilliant move for unity that helped reconcile North and South? Or was it a squandered chance for accountability that allowed the injustices of slavery and secession to go inadequately addressed? And what insights can we gain from a moment that was simultaneously a closure and a genesis, ending one era of American history while beginning another that would be marked by both progress and continued struggle? Share your opinions in the comments section below. If this deep exploration of history resonated with you, please show your support with a like and share this video with others who appreciate nuanced historical analysis. To continue uncovering layers of the past with us, subscribe to Rootvolutionary and activate notifications for all our new releases that challenge conventional historical narratives.